In 1865, Eureka Springs was a small town still trying to heal from the Civil War scars. The air in the Ozark Mountains carried a kind of uneasy peace, quiet but never truly still. The war had ended, but the ghosts it left behind were many, and they lingered in the eyes of those who had lost too much. The town was built on mist and superstition, surrounded by forests that seemed to whisper when the wind moved through them. People here spoke in hushed tones about things they couldn't explain: disappearing livestock, strange sounds near the springs at night, and an old superstition that the water could both heal and curse. At the edge of town stood a two-story wooden house, painted white once but now faded into the color of ash. Its windows faced the dense woods, where fog clung to the trees like a second skin. Inside lived a widow named Clara Whitlock. She was in her late 30s but looked older. Grief had a way of marking her face deeper than age ever could. Her husband, Thomas Whitlock, had been found dead near the spring one cold November morning. The town said it was an accident, a fall perhaps, or a robbery gone wrong, but Clara didn't believe it. What troubled everyone more, though, was that she couldn't stop visiting the spot where he died. Every morning, no matter the weather, she would walk down the dirt road to the spring and sit there for hours, staring at the ground as if waiting for the earth to speak. Before the tragedy, the Whitlocks had been known as respectable people. Thomas owned a general store near the center of town, a modest but well-kept place that sold everything from lamp oil to sugar. Clara helped him sometimes, though she was known to keep to herself. She had been a schoolteacher before marrying Thomas, and people remembered her as quiet, polite, and well-read, a woman who believed in good manners and scripture. They had no children, though rumor had it that Clara had lost a baby years earlier. People didn't ask much about it. In small towns like Eureka Springs, certain topics were best left buried under polite silence. Their marriage from the outside seemed peaceful, but in a place where gossip was a kind of currency, there were always whispers. Some said Thomas had been drinking more than usual in the months before his death. Others mentioned hearing arguments from the Whitlock home late at night, her voice trembling but sharp and his low and angry. It wasn't unusual, the war had changed men. Many came back broken, haunted by what they had seen. Thomas was one of them. He had fought for the Confederacy and returned quieter, colder. There were stories about his temper, how he'd snapped at customers, even struck a man once over a debt. But no one ever thought he'd end up dead. Clara's visits to the spring began the morning after the funeral. She wore the same black dress every day with a thin shawl that fluttered in the wind. People tried to talk to her at first, to offer food, company, prayers, but she refused all of it. When Sheriff Abner Crowley asked why she kept going back, she only said, "He's still there." Her words made the townspeople uneasy. Some thought she meant his spirit. Others wondered if she knew something no one else did. The spring itself was a strange place, both beautiful and unsettling. The water glowed faintly under the moonlight, reflecting the stars in a way that didn't seem quite natural. Local legend said the spring had healing powers. People came from miles away to bathe in it, hoping to cure ailments that medicine couldn't touch. But the older folks warned of its darker side. They said the spring demanded something in return. A life, perhaps, a secret. In the months before Thomas's death, Clara had seemed restless. She was often seen walking near the spring alone at dusk, clutching a worn leather journal. Some thought she was writing letters to her late child. Others believed she was praying. The truth was that no one really knew what went on inside her mind. She was not the kind of woman who shared her thoughts freely, and since her husband's death, she had become even more distant, like someone standing behind a window watching life go on without her. The sheriff had his doubts about the official story. The body had been found with strange bruises on the arms and neck, as if someone had held him down. There were no witnesses and no sign of robbery. His wedding ring was still on his hand, his pocket watch still ticking when they found him. But the town didn't want more trouble. After years of war, they wanted peace, and so they buried Thomas quickly and told themselves it was over. Clara didn't seem to agree. Her grief had a sharpness to it, something almost feverish. There were nights when neighbors swore they saw her lantern flickering by the spring long after midnight. Others claimed to hear her talking to someone, her voice low but urgent, carried through the trees. When asked, she denied it all, smiling in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. Life in Eureka Springs moved on, or at least pretended to. The townsfolk tried to ignore the widow who lingered where her husband died, the strange look in her eyes, the quiet that seemed to follow her wherever she went. But something about her presence kept unsettling them. They began to wonder if she was searching for answers, or if she already knew them. And though no one said it aloud, they all began to feel it, that something terrible had happened at that spring, something that hadn't been buried with Thomas Whitlock, something that refused to stay quiet. In the months leading up to Thomas Whitlock's death, life in Eureka Springs began to darken in quiet, almost invisible ways. It started with little things, arguments overheard through thin walls, money gone missing from the till at the general store, strange visitors asking for Thomas when he wasn't around. But like rot spreading through old wood, the problems grew beneath the surface until they couldn't be ignored. Clara noticed the changes first. Thomas had always been a steady man, careful with his words and his work. But lately there was something different in him, a restlessness she couldn't name. He would leave early in the morning before the store opened, saying he had business in Berryville or Fayetteville, though he often came home after dark with no goods, no explanation, and the smell of whiskey on his breath. When she asked where he'd been, he would snap at her, sometimes slamming his hand against the table so hard that the plates jumped. "Don't start with your questions again, Clara," he'd say. "You wouldn't understand." There was a woman in town named Mabel Turner, a widow like Clara, though younger and far less proper. She ran a boarding house for travelers near the edge of town, and people talked about her freely, how she smiled too long at married men, how her dresses were too bright for a woman in mourning. Clara had caught Thomas speaking to Mabel more than once. At first, she thought little of it. But soon, Thomas began disappearing for hours, and when he returned, he was quieter, meaner. She began to suspect things she didn't want to believe. One night, she followed him. She waited until the lamps in the house went dark, then wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and walked out into the cold. The moon was thin and white, and the road to the boarding house was muddy from last night's rain. She saw him there, through the window, standing too close to Mabel, his hand brushing hers as she poured him a drink. Clara stood outside in the dark for a long time, watching the way Mabel laughed, the way Thomas smiled at her. Something inside her cracked that night, quiet and deep. She said nothing when he came home, just watched him undress and lie beside her as if nothing had changed. But in her mind, something had already begun to unravel. The next morning, she wrote in her journal for hours. No one knew what she wrote about, but from that day on, her handwriting became tighter, angrier. She began to keep to herself more, barely speaking to anyone. The few who saw her said she looked hollowed out, her eyes sunken and red as if she hadn't slept. At the same time, Thomas's business was failing. The war had left the town poor. Soldiers who returned had little money to spend, and many families had lost everything. Credit was stretched thin, and people were buying on promises they couldn't keep. Thomas started borrowing from a man named Silas Dodd, a former Confederate soldier who turned into something like a loan shark. Silas was known for his temper and his cruelty. He lent money easily but collected it harshly. Some said he once broken a man's arm over a missed payment. Thomas owed Silas more than he could repay. When he couldn't come up with the money, Silas began showing up at the store, standing at the counter for hours, his eyes fixed on Thomas. It made the customers uneasy. There were rumors that Thomas had begun selling off his stock in secret, or even had stolen from other merchants to stay afloat. Clara, sensing something was wrong, asked him one night if they were in trouble. He didn't answer at first. Then he laughed bitterly. "We're all in trouble, Clara. The whole damned town is." She had never heard him curse before. By late summer, the tension in their house was unbearable. Thomas barely looked at her anymore. When he did, it was with something like disgust. One night, after another argument about money, he accused her of being the reason for his misfortunes. "You bring nothing but bad luck," he shouted, slamming his fist against the wall. "You couldn't even give me a child." The words hung in the air like smoke. Clara just stared at him, her face pale, her hands trembling. She didn't cry. She simply walked away. That was the last real conversation they had. But others were talking. Some said Clara had begun visiting Reverend Alden late at night, asking him strange questions about sin and forgiveness. Others claimed she was seen down by the spring, whispering to herself, sometimes with a small bundle in her hands, a lock of hair, maybe, or something wrapped in cloth. Her grief had turned into something else, something darker. But at that time, no one dared say it aloud. They pitied her instead, thinking she was losing her mind. In truth, Clara was not losing her mind, she was planning. Meanwhile, Thomas's dealings with Silas grew more dangerous. Silas had started threatening him openly, saying he'd take the store, or worse, if the debt wasn't paid. Thomas grew desperate. He began drinking more, disappearing for days. Some believed he had turned to smuggling goods through the woods, working with ex-soldiers who ran stolen supplies between towns. It was risky business, but men did what they had to survive. Around this time, a young boy named Eli, who helped at the store, overheard something he shouldn't have. One night after closing, Thomas was speaking with Silas. Eli hid behind a stack of crates and listened. Silas said something about the spring and burying it where no one would find it. Thomas's voice trembled when he replied, "It's done. No one knows." The next morning, Silas was gone and Thomas seemed shaken. Eli never told anyone what he heard, at least not until after everything that followed. Clara felt the distance growing between them like a wall. She tried at first to bring him back, to remind him of the man he used to be. She cooked his favorite meals, read to him in the evenings, and even begged him to pray with her, but he refused. "You think prayer will fix this?" he said one night. "You think God's listening?" His eyes were bloodshot, his hands shaking. "You don't know what kind of man I've become, Clara. You don't want to." That was the first time she truly feared him, not for what he might do to her, but for what he might already have done. The autumn that year was unusually cold. Leaves fell early and the nights came faster, heavier. Clara's visits to the spring became more frequent. Sometimes she stayed until dawn, sitting by the water in silence. People began to avoid the area after dark, afraid of running into her. Children whispered that the widow spoke to ghosts there. Some said they'd seen her kneeling in the mud, digging with her bare hands. It was around this time that Mabel Turner suddenly left town. No one knew why. She packed her belongings one morning and was gone by evening. When asked, Thomas said nothing, only poured himself another drink. But later that night, Clara burned something in the fireplace, a red scarf that had not belonged to her. The following weeks were filled with unease. The sheriff visited the Whitlock home twice, once about a complaint of shouting, another time after someone reported seeing Thomas and Silas arguing near the woods. Both men were drunk, their words slurred and angry. Witnesses said Silas had grabbed Thomas by the collar and hissed something about taking back what's mine. A week later, Silas disappeared too. The people of Eureka Springs had seen enough death and hardship not to ask too many questions. They assumed Silas had skipped town, maybe joined one of the gangs moving west. But Clara noticed the way her husband's hands shook after that, the way he avoided her eyes. Something inside her told her the truth, that whatever had happened at that spring, it was tied to Silas, to the money, to the secret Thomas carried like a sickness. By November, Clara barely recognized her husband. He was gaunt, paranoid, muttering to himself at night. He said he could hear Silas's voice when the wind blew. He said the spring was cursed. She would wake up to find him standing at the window, staring out into the woods, whispering that someone was watching the house. When she tried to comfort him, he pushed her away. "Don't touch me," he'd say. "You don't understand what I've done." But Clara did understand. She had spent weeks piecing it together from the fragments he let slip, the money, the fights, the disappearances. The man she had married was gone, replaced by someone consumed by guilt and fear. She began to write again, her journal now filled with lines that made little sense but spoke of vengeance, forgiveness, and sin. On the night before his death, Thomas left the house without saying a word. Clara watched him from the window as he walked toward the spring, a lantern swinging from his hand. The moon was low and the air was sharp with frost. He didn't come back. That was the night everything broke, the night when the secrets buried beneath Eureka Springs began to stir. The next morning they found him by the water, his body half in the mud, his face turned toward the sky. And when they told Clara, she didn't cry, she just whispered, "I told him it would come for him." From that day on, she kept returning to the place where he died, not to mourn, but as if waiting for the spring to give up the rest of its secrets. The townspeople said grief had driven her mad, but others thought she was still listening, to the whispers in the water, to the things Thomas had buried there, to the truth no one else dared to face. The unease that had been building in Eureka Springs now hung heavy over everyone. People began locking their doors at night. They spoke less, avoided the spring altogether. It wasn't just fear, it was guilt. Because deep down, they all knew something about that place wasn't right, and they feared that Clara Whitlock wasn't the only one who couldn't stay away. The night it happened was one of those nights that felt wrong from the start. The air was heavy, and the clouds hung low over Eureka Springs like smoke that refused to clear. The sound of crickets had gone quiet, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Clara Whitlock sat alone in her parlor, staring at the dying fire. Her hands were folded in her lap, though her fingers twitched every few seconds like something inside her was struggling to break free. She had not eaten all day. Her black shawl was still wrapped around her shoulders, though the room was warm. Thomas had been drinking since morning. The bottle of rye whiskey sat half empty on the table, next to his ledger and a small revolver he kept for protection. He had become a man she no longer knew, paranoid, desperate, haunted. The debts, the guilt, and the voices he swore he heard at night had carved him into something feral. He'd been muttering to himself for hours, packing back and forth across the creaking wooden floor. They know, he kept saying under his breath. They all know, Silas told her, he told her before he died. Clara didn't answer. She just watched him, her eyes empty but calm. It had been weeks since Silas Dodd disappeared, and the whole town had quietly agreed not to ask too many questions. But Clara had asked them anyway, at first softly, then with insistence. She wanted to understand what her husband was hiding, what kind of man she'd really married. But every time she got close to the truth, he'd lash out. That night something in Thomas snapped. He accused her of knowing too much, of following him to the spring, of trying to ruin him. His voice grew louder until it filled the small house. "You think you're better than me? You think your prayers will save you?" he shouted, his face red, his breath thick with alcohol. He slammed his hand down on the table, rattling the glass. "You don't understand, Clara. I didn't mean to. It wasn't supposed to happen." Her voice, when it came, was quiet. "Then tell me what did happen, Thomas." He stared at her for a long time, breathing hard. For a moment he looked almost frightened. Then he sank into the chair across from her, rubbing his face with both hands. "Silas came to collect," he said. "He said he'd take the store if I didn't pay. I told him I had nothing left. He didn't believe me. We fought by the spring. I hit him, he fell. God, Clara, he hit the rocks. He wasn't moving." Clara's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't move. "And then," she whispered. "I buried him," Thomas said. His voice was hollow now, flat, as if the words had been trapped inside him for too long. "Right there by the spring. The ground was soft. I thought no one would find him." Silence filled the room. The only sound was the ticking of the clock above the mantel. Then Clara spoke again, her tone calm and deliberate. "You killed him." Thomas looked up sharply. "No," he said, shaking his head. "It was an accident. You have to understand, he was threatening me." Her voice didn't rise, but her eyes burned with something sharp. "You killed him," she said again. "And you let the whole town think you were just another broken man. You let me think you were the victim." He stood unsteady on his feet. "You don't know what you're talking about. You don't know what it's like." She rose too, her hands trembling now, though her face stayed still. "No, Thomas," she said softly. "You don't know what it's like to lose everything because of the man you love." That was when he realized. The way she looked at him, there was no fear in her anymore, only understanding, and something else. He took a step back. "What did you do, Clara?" She didn't answer. She walked to the mantel where a small lantern burned low and picked it up. "Do you remember what you told me the night before our child died?" she said quietly. "You said it was God's will. You said I shouldn't question it." Thomas's voice broke. "Clara, please." She turned to face him, her eyes shining in the flickering light. "You buried a man in the same place I buried my prayers. Maybe that spring was always cursed, Thomas. Maybe it takes what it's owed." He lunged toward her then, reaching for the gun on the table, but she was faster. She swung the lantern and it shattered against his arm, spilling fire across the floor. The oil caught instantly, flames crawling up the wall like hungry hands. Thomas stumbled back, shouting in pain, knocking over the chair. The revolver clattered to the ground. Smoke filled the room, thick and choking. Clara stood frozen for a moment, watching the fire spread. Then she saw Thomas on his knees now, his shirt sleeve burning, his eyes wide with terror. "Help me!" he screamed. "Clara, help me!" For a moment she almost did. Instinct made her take a step forward. But then she stopped. Her mind was a blur of grief and fury and something darker, a quiet voice that whispered, "He took everything from you." She backed away slowly, her eyes never leaving him. "You said the spring takes what it's owed," she murmured. "Now it's coming for you." He tried to crawl toward her, but the smoke was too thick. His voice broke into coughing and then silence. Clara turned and fled through the back door, gasping for air as she stumbled into the cold night. Behind her, the house burned brighter, lighting up the trees like a twisted sunrise. The neighbors came running soon after. They found Clara in the yard, her face streaked with soot, her hair wild, her dress torn. She was trembling but silent. When they asked what happened, she said only, "He went back to the spring." By morning, the fire had burned itself out. The house was a blackened skeleton of wood and ash. But the sheriff found no body inside, only Thomas's revolver, half buried in the dirt near the back door, and a trail of footprints leading toward the woods. They followed the prints until they reached the spring. There, half in the mud and half in the water, lay Thomas Whitlock. His face was pale, his hands stiff and open, as though he'd tried to claw his way out of the earth. The sheriff said it looked like he'd drowned, though the water was shallow. No one could explain the deep bruises around his neck, or the look of terror frozen in his eyes. When they told Clara, she didn't scream or faint. She simply nodded as if she had expected it. "He's with the others now," she said quietly. The sheriff didn't understand. What others? She looked toward the woods, her expression unreadable. The ones who never left this place. For days after, she stayed near the spring. The townspeople tried to keep her away, saying it wasn't good for her, that it would only make her grief worse. But she refused. She said she could still hear him there, whispering to her through the water. Some believed she had lost her mind completely. Others thought she was haunted by guilt. But there were a few, those who remembered Sela's Dodd, those who had seen things they couldn't explain, who whispered that maybe she hadn't gone mad at all. Maybe she was just waiting for the spring to finish what it had started. And so she kept going back day after day, sitting by the water where her husband's life had ended. The ground there was damp and dark, and sometimes, when the light hit it just right, it shimmered faintly red beneath the surface, as if the earth itself remembered the blood it had taken. No one ever went near the place again after that. Not at night, not when the wind was still. Because sometimes, when the moon was low and the air was quiet, people swore they could see her silhouette by the water's edge, motionless, waiting, listening. And if you got too close, they said you could hear another voice, deeper, broken, whispering her name from beneath the spring. The morning after the fire, a heavy fog blanketed Eureka Springs, muffling every sound. The town woke to the smell of smoke and the uneasy silence that follows tragedy. What had once been the Whitlock home now stood as a pile of scorched timber and blackened earth. The air still carried the scent of charred wood and something metallic underneath, something that clung to the back of the throat and refused to fade. Sheriff Abner Crowley stood at the edge of the ruins, his hat pressed against his chest. He was a man hardened by war and death, but even he looked shaken. The Whitlocks had been part of this town for years. Their story, like so many others, had been one of quiet survival after the war. But now it was something else, a reminder that the past never stayed buried in a place like Eureka Springs. Thomas Whitlock's body was found at the spring later that morning, his skin cold, his mouth open as if he had tried to speak one last time. The sheriff's men carried him back on a wooden stretcher, and people lined the road in silence. No one spoke to Clara as she stood there, wrapped in her soot-stained shawl, her face pale and still. The only sound was the slow creak of the stretcher wheels over the dirt road. When they reached the churchyard, Reverend Alden came forward. He tried to speak to Clara to offer comfort, but she didn't look at him. She just said, "He found his way back. That's where he belonged." Her voice was calm, almost soft, but there was something in her tone that made everyone uneasy. Rumors spread fast. Some said Thomas had taken his own life out of guilt. Others whispered that Clara had done it, that she had followed him to the spring and finished what the fire had started. A few claimed the spring itself had taken him, that it had been waiting all along. In a town where superstition lived side by side with faith, the line between truth and legend blurred easily. Sheriff Crowley tried to piece together what had happened. He questioned Clara for hours, but she never changed her story. "The fire started by accident," she said. "Thomas ran, I tried to follow, but he was gone." Her eyes never wavered, her hands never shook. Yet something in her stillness unsettled the sheriff. It was not grief that he saw in her. It was something quieter, something almost like peace. Without evidence of foul play, the case was closed as an accident. The townspeople accepted it outwardly, though in private, the whispers continued. At the store, at the church, even at the well, people speculated about what had really happened that night. The truth became a kind of ghost that lingered between them, haunting conversations that always ended in silence. Life in Eureka Springs moved on, as it always did after tragedy. The war had taught people to bury their pain quickly and keep living, but something about the Whitlock fire lingered longer than usual. The store remained closed, its windows boarded up. The spring, once a place people visited for its healing waters, was now avoided. Children were warned not to go near it. Travelers who came through the town would ask about the burned house and the widow who still walked to the spring every morning. The locals would tell them it was best not to ask. Clara became a shadow in her own town. She rarely spoke to anyone, rarely ate in public. She lived in a small cabin near the woods given to her by a kind neighbor who pitied her. Every morning she dressed in black, tied her hair back, and made her way to the spring. She would sit there for hours, staring at the water, sometimes whispering under her breath. Those who dared to watch from a distance said her lips moved as if she were speaking to someone only she could see. Reverend Alden tried to help her, visiting often with a Bible in hand. He spoke of forgiveness and redemption, of letting go of what haunted her. She listened quietly, then one day interrupted him. "You don't understand, Reverend," she said. "The spring remembers. It takes what people bury in it, lies, guilt, secrets. It doesn't forget." He told her it was grief speaking, that she was carrying too much. She only smiled faintly. "You'll see," she whispered. "The ground always gives back what we try to hide." The sheriff never stopped thinking about the case, even after it was closed. Something about the footprints at the scene, the way they disappeared near the water, didn't sit right with him. On quiet nights, he would walk to the spring, lantern in hand, hoping to find answers. But every time he got close, the air grew cold, and the feeling of being watched crept over him until he turned back. After a while, he stopped trying. Some truths, he decided, were better left alone. The townspeople tried to move forward, but the story of the Whitlocks became part of the town's whispers, told in low voices around fires and in the corners of taverns. Mothers warned their children not to go near the spring, not because of ghosts, but because of what grief could do to a person. Clara's reputation shifted over time. Once seen as the quiet schoolteacher's wife, she became something else, a figure of both pity and fear. Some said she was cursed, that she carried the sin of her husband's crime and her own part in it. Others pitied her, saying she was a woman driven mad by loss. But no one dared to say it to her face. There was something in her eyes that silenced people, the look of someone who had seen too much and come back with nothing left to lose. By the following spring, her health began to fade. She grew thinner, weaker. Some days she didn't make it to the spring, but when she did, she'd sit longer than before, her frail figure motionless against the gray water. One morning, a farmer passing by found her shawl folded neatly on the bank. Her footprints led into the water, but none were leading back. They searched for days, but never found her body. Some believed she drowned herself, finally giving in to her grief. Others said the spring had claimed her, too. Reverend Alden led a small service, reading verses about peace and forgiveness. But even he couldn't hide the tremor in his voice when he said her name. After her disappearance, strange things began to happen near the spring. People said they heard voices there, soft, overlapping whispers that sounded like water speaking. Sometimes in the morning mist, two figures could be seen standing at the edge, a man and a woman, side by side, unmoving. The sheriff dismissed it as imagination, but he never went back there after sunset. Over the years, the story of Clara and Thomas Whitlock became part of the town's folklore. Parents told it as a warning about guilt and obsession. Travelers passing through heard it as a tale of madness and revenge. But for those who had lived through it, it was something deeper, a quiet wound that never healed, a reminder of how thin the line was between love and ruin. The spring still runs to this day, its water clear and cold, reflecting the sky like glass. But no one drinks from it anymore. No one goes near after dark. And when the wind moves through the trees, it carries a faint echo of a woman's voice, soft, broken, and unending, whispering a name the earth will never forget. Years passed, and the story of the Whitlocks became less a tragedy and more a quiet lesson that the people of Eureka Springs carried without realizing it. The spring still flowed, its waters clear but untrusted, and the hill where the Whitlock house once stood grew wild with ivy and weeds. The townspeople said the land was cursed, but it wasn't the ground they feared, it was memory itself. The kind that never really faded, even when time tried to wash it away. Sheriff Abner Crowley retired a few years after Clara's disappearance. He was never the same after the fire. People noticed he avoided the spring road and that his once steady hands trembled when he passed by the churchyard. He carried his guilt quietly, the way men of that time did. He had seen too much death in the war to call himself sentimental, yet something about Clara stayed with him. Some nights after too much whiskey, he'd tell his wife he wished he'd asked her one more question, not about the fire, but about the look in her eyes that morning when she said, "He found his way back." It wasn't the look of a woman who had lost her husband. It was the look of someone who had made peace with something no one else could understand. Reverend Alden continued his work for many years, though his sermons changed after the Whitlocks. He spoke less about sin and more about mercy, less about damnation and more about what people carry in silence. He'd often mention the dangers of letting guilt live too long in a person's heart, how it becomes something else, something that changes the way the world feels. "Not every haunting," he once said, "comes from the dead." The congregation thought it was just a metaphor. But those who had lived in Eureka Springs long enough knew he was speaking about Clara. Younger generation grew up hearing the story as a warning. It was told by lamplight, usually beginning with the same words, "They say she still walks by the spring." Over time, the story shifted. Some said Clara had killed her husband and burned the house to cover it up. Others claimed Thomas's ghost had lured her to the water. A few said they were both victims of something darker, something that had always been buried beneath the town itself. But truth has a strange way of bending with every retelling. What remained constant was the feeling that the story meant something, that it revealed what grief, shame, and secrecy could do to people. The law had done what it could back then. No charges, no arrests, no verdicts, just ashes, whispers, and unanswered questions. Justice, if it ever existed for the Whitlocks, had come in a form no court could name. It wasn't about punishment. It was about the slow unraveling that follows when truth is buried too deep. In that sense, justice had been served in its own cruel way. Clara had lived long enough to face what she'd done, or what she believed she'd done, and that might have been worse than any jail cell. For the town, the Whitlocks' tragedy marked an unspoken shift. Before the fire, people trusted easily. They believed that God watched over every home and that goodness, even when tested, would be rewarded. After the fire, that belief dimmed. They locked their doors at night. They kept their secrets closer. And when they looked into the spring, they no longer saw healing. They saw reflection, and reflection made them uneasy. Years later, when the railroad began bringing new settlers into Eureka Springs, few of them knew the story. The old-timers didn't speak of it anymore, not openly. But sometimes, when someone mentioned the strange fog that rolled over the town in early mornings, the elders would glance toward the hill and exchange a look that said, "Best not to dig too deep." There's something about stories like the Whitlocks that stays beneath the surface, just like the things people bury in their hearts. Clara's visits to the spring had become more than grief. They were confession, ritual, and punishment all at once. Some people understood that. Others called it madness. But maybe it was something simpler, a woman's attempt to face the truth in a world that wouldn't let her speak it. No one ever rebuilt the Whitlock home. Nature took it back piece by piece until even the foundation disappeared under the earth. Children growing up nearby would sometimes find bits of charred brick or blackened nails and carry them home as curiosities, not knowing what ground they had come from. History, after all, doesn't vanish. It just sinks lower, waiting for someone curious enough or unlucky enough to uncover it again. When the old sheriff died, they found among his things a small wooden box. Inside was a rusted key, a burned button, and a note written in his shaky handwriting. It said only, "Some things the water keeps, some things it gives back." His wife never spoke of it, and the box was buried with him. As time went on, the spring became less a place of fear and more of quiet fascination. People who came to the town in later decades would visit it the way one visits a grave, respectful, cautious, unsure if they believed the stories but unwilling to test them. The water still ran clear, cold, and unending. If you listened closely, you could almost convince yourself the sound of the current was just that, running water. But if you stayed long enough, if the wind died and the world went still, it was said you might hear another sound beneath it. A whisper. A woman's voice calling out softly, not in fear or anger, but in recognition. The story of Clara and Thomas Whitlock wasn't about ghosts, not really. It was about the quiet cruelty of secrets, the way love can twist into something desperate when held too tightly, and how guilt can turn a person into their own haunting. It showed the town, and maybe anyone who heard it, that justice isn't always what we think it is. Sometimes it's a life spent remembering. Sometimes it's silence. Sometimes it's the spring itself, reflecting everything at us, asking what we would have done in their place. Eureka Springs moved forward as towns do. The mines reopened, the hotels filled with travelers, and the town found its rhythm again. But under the noise of progress, there remained a stillness, an echo that time never managed to erase. It lingered in the fog, in the chill of the morning air, and in the way people lowered their voices when the past came up. And so the story ended where it began, with water, memory, and the question that no one could answer. Did Clara Whitlock take her husband's life, or did grief do it for her? Maybe the difference didn't matter anymore. What mattered was what the story left behind, a lesson whispered through generations about love, guilt, and the dangerous weight of silence. To this day, when the fog settles over the spring and the air grows heavy, some say you can see two figures in the mist, side by side. The man's hand rests gently on the woman's shoulder. The water ripples around them, soft and endless. Then, as the morning light breaks, they fade together, leaving only the sound of the spring, carrying their story forward into another quiet day in Eureka Springs.